On behalf of the Václav Havel Library, allow me to welcome you in Prague, where we meet at the Forum 2000. It's a great pleasure to have a few minutes with you here. And belated congratulations on the 2022 Václav Havel Prize for Human Rights. We all, of course, regretted not being able to give it to you in person, but we were all the more excited back in August to know that you are once again a free man walking the streets. Where does Havel figure in your mental universe? Allow me to start with that question.
Well, a few months ago, when I was sitting in my solitary confinement cell in the maximum security prison number 6 in the city of Omsk, I read Václav Havel's Power of the Powerless. To me, it's one of the most important works in the history of the anti-communist dissent in Eastern Europe. And actually, about the same time, I read another great essay from the same period, what is also a very important document in the history of Eastern European anti-communist dissent. It is Live Not by Lies by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Both works written in the 1970s, and both works, to me, based on a very common, very important idea that for a system that is built entirely on a foundation of lies, the most effective and the most dangerous act of civic resistance in that system is simply living the truth, simply refusing to go along with the lies, to support these lies, to be a part of these lies. And I was reading that essay by Havel, written almost half a century ago in 1978, and every sentence, every word of that essay seemed as topical as ever today. Of course, he was speaking, just as Solzhenitsyn was speaking, about the communist system that existed back then. But I think all the principles that are enshrined in this work, in both of these works, are completely applicable to the dictatorship that has been built by Vladimir Putin that exists in our country today. Because just as back then, the system we have in Russia today is based on a foundation of lies. And just as half a century ago, today, the most dangerous and the most effective act of, and the most important act of civic resistance to this system is simply living the truth. This is why the Putin dictatorship is so afraid of everyone who dares to speak out publicly about this regime, about its repressions inside the country, and about its murderous and aggressive war against Ukraine. This is why such harsh repressions are unleashed by the Kremlin against all of those Russians who dare to speak the truth in a system that is based completely on lies.
It's certainly true that in 1978, when Havel published The Power of the Powerless, he was calling out ordinary Czechoslovak, Polish, and so on citizens, using the metaphor of the greengrocer, who puts in a sign in his shop window without knowing what the sign means, without caring for that. He does that simply because he knows that is what the system requires of him, and that is the price that he has to pay to be left alone, to go on living. And he is living a lie in that regard. And more to the point, he's deluding himself in the sense that he considers himself powerless to change the system. So my next question to you is, where does the source of your power come from? Given that, objectively speaking, in that prison near Omsk, you were even far more powerless than an ordinary greengrocer who can walk the streets after all, and so on. What is the deep source of this courage? How did you find that in yourself?
Well, first of all, it's not courage, it's stubbornness. That's what I always say, and that's certainly a quality that's required for an opposition politician in Russia. Nothing can be done without this. Well, look, I've been doing this for 25 years. I came to work with Boris Nemtsov, who was the leader of the democratic opposition in Russia, at the end of 1999, about the same time that Vladimir Putin was coming to power. And over these past years, over this past quarter of a century, we have witnessed Putin transform our country from the imperfect democracy we had back in the 1990s to a perfect dictatorship that it is today. A dictatorship that represses the rights and freedoms of its own people, and that tramples and destroys, the civilized norms of international behavior by attacking and invading other countries. And I'm not okay with that. I consider myself to be a Russian patriot in the truest sense of that term. I love my country. I care about my country. I think that Russia deserves a much better future, much better fate than to be ruled by a murderous, aggressive, corrupt, authoritarian dictatorship. And so I consider it to be my civic duty, my responsibility, not only as a politician, but just as a Russian citizen, to stand up to this system, to not live by lies, as Solzhenitsyn and Havel and Power of the Powerless have taught us all these years ago. Well, that's the price that we have to pay. But, you know, when I was sitting in that solitary confinement cell in Siberia, and I'm not going to pretend, you know, that it's not hard. It is. It's you know, every day waking up in that small space, cupboard-like 2 by 3 meters, you know, just 4 walls, a small window with metal bars. Your bunk gets attached to the wall at 5 o'clock in the morning, and all day you just sort of walk in that small circle in a cell, completely alone. You have nobody to speak to, you have nowhere to go, you have nothing to do. Not allowed to speak to your family, not allowed to go to church, not allowed to write except for 90 minutes a day when they give you pen and paper. It's not a pleasant experience. Again, I'm not gonna sort of, you know, deny that. But what helped me kept going in there, I would name 3 things. The first was my Christian faith, because I know that at the end of the day, everything is going to be up to Him, not up to some people who think that they decide everything and who write these big numbers on papers, you know, with stamps and signatures on them. The second thing I would say that helped me in there was my education and my background as a historian. And I would actually say that my historical education perhaps never came as useful to me as it did when I was in prison, because all of these things have happened in our history before, and we know how they end. And this will end in exactly the same way. Because, you know, history has its own logic, its own models of development, and nobody's ever been able to change that, and Vladimir Putin is not going to be able to either. But the third thing, I would say, you know, many years ago, 2 decades ago now, I made a documentary film about the Soviet dissident movement, about the people who had the courage to stand up to the Soviet totalitarian regime back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. The film was called They Chose Freedom. And one of the people I interviewed for that film was Vladimir Bukovsky, a very prominent Soviet-era dissident, a writer, a political prisoner who spent nearly 12 years in the Soviet Gulag. And I asked him what kept him going, what helped him survive in those prisons and labor camps. And he looked at me and he said, I knew that I was right. I knew that I was right. And at the time I just thought this was a nice sounding phrase. And of course I put it in the film because it sounded good. But having now gone through this experience myself, I know just how true those words are and how important they are. Because, you know, even in my darkest days in that prison in Omsk, I knew that I was right. I knew that the real criminals are those people who are sitting in the Kremlin who have started this war in Ukraine, not those of us who are in prison because we opposed it. And that knowledge is very important, because when you know that you're right, the fear and the doubt just go away.
Would you? That's a very powerful set of remarks. I apologize for having to take a second. I do have one more question, and this is more of my own curiosity, really. To what extent do your countless Pulitzer Prize-winning letters from prison to the Washington Post figure in this exercise of power, fundamental powers of a citizen, this claiming of responsibility for the world, this hope that things will eventually turn out the way you believe they'll turn out?
Well, I think word is the most important, the most powerful weapon we have, much more powerful than any armaments can ever be. And I've worked as a journalist for many, many years, and I do appreciate the importance of the spoken and the written word. And so when I was locked up in that prison in Siberia in solitary confinement, the only way I could continue to express myself was through these letters that I could write from prison. And that's how I passed out my articles to the Washington Post and, you know, to other publications too, with just handwritten notes. And I had to improve my handwriting quite a while, because by the moment when I was arrested, I hadn't really used my handwriting a lot, as you know, a few of us do now in this modern day and age with all the computers and phones and everything, but I really had to improve it to make sure that people understood what I was writing. And I felt that it was important to continue to speak out, whatever conditions I was put in. Again, that's my civic duty. That's what I feel that I have to do. And we know that what the Putin regime is most afraid of, just like so many other dictatorships, is a free word spoken by citizens who are not afraid of this regime. And to your question about, my sort of optimism looking into the future, I think a lot of it is also based on my background as a historian. Because, the famous phrase, the arc of history bends towards liberty, right? It may not have bent as fast as we'd like, but the direction is unmistakable. If we look at the map of Europe, let's say just 35 years ago, it's nothing by historical standards, that's like yesterday morning, we will see that half of the countries on the map of Europe were living under repressive, dictatorial, authoritarian regimes, including the country where we are here now. If you look at the map of Europe today, you'll see only two dictatorships that are left there. That's Putin's Russia and Lukashenko's Belarus. And so the trends, the directions are completely unmistakable. And I have absolutely no doubt that the day will come when the European continent will be completely dictator-free. And everything that I do in my work, everything that I try to do, is aimed at making that day come a little faster.
And on that optimistic note, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to be a guest of the Havel Library.
Thank you.